record. Okay, there we go. Awesome. So I'll go through our agenda quickly for what we'll be chatting about today. So I'll start things off with a bit about Muskoka Conservancy. Then I'll go through the few little things that you need to identify trees and some tools that will help you with that. Then we will look at what specifically you'll want to look at when identifying trees without leaves. And we'll look, I'll go through what you want to consider for our conifers as well as for deciduous trees. Then we will go through how to identify 20 common Muskoka species. So hopefully I'll be able to get through all of those relatively easily. And then I've also added a little bonus for our spring ephemerals, which are on their way because they are really exciting and I'm really looking forward to seeing them in the upcoming months. So I had to include those too. So a bit about Muskoka Conservancy. If you are new, we are the land trust of Muskoka. So we've been around since 1987, so for 36 years this year. And our main mission is to conserve the nature of Muskoka through land acquisition and protection. So our first protected property was a nature reserve called J.P. McVitie, which is on Eileen Gowan in Lake Muskoka. And I believe that was back in 1990 or 89 that one was first protected. So the way we are able to acquire and protect land is either through really generous community donations of land or through community fundraising or even grants and different sources of funding that we're able to get to purchase land. So through those means, we are currently protecting 51 different properties across Muskoka, including almost 4,000 acres of land in total, over 60,000 feet of sensitive shoreline, both on our large and major lakes, as well as some of our smaller but equally important lakes as well, and over 700 acres of wetland as well. So we have a variety of different habitats providing, land and ecosystems for many different species, including many species at risk. So we are very happy that we're able to protect this land in perpetuity forever for these species. Some of our properties are also accessible or have access points and trails, but most are closed and strictly for nature protection. So they are only accessible through some expert guided hikes that we'll do called our nature quests. And lastly, I'll just mention that we are a charity as well. So we rely heavily on our amazing members and our very, very important and amazing group of volunteers who support us and help to run many events that we have throughout the years. So if you're ever interested in becoming more involved, or even if you just have some questions, I do have my contact information on the last question slide that we have as well. So you can always give me a call or send me an email. The property that is pictured here is our Barkway Lake Nature Reserve. So this is our 51st property. And we went to visit it just earlier this month. So we've got a beautiful stand of young hardwoods here, deciduous trees. So I thought that was a nice fitting picture for this presentation. But now we will jump into our tree ID. So what exactly do you need to identify trees? There isn't much that you need, but there are a few things that can be quite helpful. The first being binoculars. These can be very helpful, especially when you are looking at a very old and mature tree where the buds and leaves aren't accessible right at your fingertips close to the ground, but you need to look way up into the canopy to actually see them. So having binoculars to get you a closer look at them can be very helpful. Sometimes you might think, oh, I'll just look at what leaves have fallen on the ground, and that for sure will be what the tree is. But of course, wind might have blown those there. Something could have happened, and it may not actually be that those leaves below the tree are what the tree actually is. So being thorough and using your binoculars to check can be very helpful. Another thing that can be helpful when looking at the opposite, when looking at young trees where you can actually see the twigs and leaves, is a hand lens. So I've got one with me here today. You can just get one online. They're sold in multiple different areas or places. And essentially it's a hand lens or magnifying glass that helps you get a closer look at the fine details of twigs or leaves. So whether you're looking at a twig and usually it's one that will have hair on the buds, you might need a hand lens to be able to clearly see that, or even to see the serrated edges of the leaves or the veining or something like that. So a hand lens can be quite handy as well. And lastly, a tree ID field guide or key. So I've got mine here with me today, which has got a ton of tags in it from when I was in school and studying all of these trees. But it's also the one that's pictured here. So it's called Trees in Canada, and it's got hundreds of different trees in there and all of the details you need, as well as some keys to help key out what species you might be looking at. So they can be really, really helpful when you're starting to learn as well. So now we will consider what we want to look for our coniferous trees. And the main things are, of course, our leaves and bark is what we'll want to check on for them. So when we are considering leaves, you'll want to consider the type of leaf, the shape of the leaf, and the arrangement as well. So when you're looking at the type, it will either be a needle, scale, or potentially absent as well. So needles, of course, are ones that look needle-like. It's a little bit hard to actually describe them, but this is our white pine here, which has needles, and this is our balsam fir over here. Hopefully you guys can see my mouse when I'm gesturing with it. And these ones have needles compared to the scales of our eastern cedar, which is on the left. So it's got scales similar to if you're thinking about a snake. They're just those individual scales, little round markings that give it that scaly look. Or they could be absent as well. So there's one family of conifer that will actually lose its needles in the winter time. So I'll give you guys a second. I'll see if anyone can comment if they know what that family is or what that specific species we have in Muskoka is. Carol said tamarack. Yeah, you got it. So tamaracks are a part of the larch family. So all members of the larch family will lose their needles in the winter, as if they were a deciduous tree. In terms of shape, it could be flat, conical, or round, or square or ridged with edges as well. So our balsam fir is flat, so it looks like it's been pressed down. The pines have conical or round shaped needles because they are round all the way. And spruces are square. So I don't have a picture here, but we'll see it when we get to our spruce species. And they have little ridges and are almost squared off. So they aren't flat and they're not round, but they're more square-like. And arrangement, of course, is the last thing we'll consider for leaves. So whether they are bundled like our pines, so all the needles are coming out of one location, or if they are single, so they're singularly coming off of a branch. Next is bark. For bark, there's just two main things you want to consider, first being the texture and second being the color. So I've got it in the wrong order here. The first one is a representation of furrowed bark. So it's very rough looking and it will have ridges and furrows within it. Next in the middle is smooth. So no furrows, no rough texture, just very smooth. So this is our balsam fir. It does have some resin blisters on it, however. And lastly, scaly. So it's like individual small scale-like sheets on it. So not like long furrows and ridges, but more of a scale. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. And you'll also want to consider the color as well, of course. Most trees will be either a gray or a brown, but some will have undertones as well. So this one here, excuse me, is our red pine. So you notice it's got a bit of a pinkish red hue to it as well. Another thing to point out with bark is that it will change with age as well. So for most of the species I'm going through today, we'll be looking specifically at the older, more mature bark, because that's when you'll want to rely and consider bark a bit more when you can't actually see the buds and the leaves that are high up in the tree. So that's another good point for bark. And now we'll get into our species. And feel free to let me know if you have any questions along the way, of course. So our first one is the eastern white pine. I've also included the scientific names here as well, mainly because they're just fun to say. There won't be a test on it at the end, so don't worry about that. But for our white pine, the scientific name is called Pinus strobus, so definitely fun to say. For the leaves of our white pine, they are needles, of course, and cone or conical shaped. They're a light bluish green. Unfortunately, some of my photos aren't the greatest, but hopefully you guys can picture it for trees that you've seen. They are considered medium to long in length, so generally between 5 and 15 centimeters, and they're quite flexible. So if you were to bend them or even try to tie them in a knot, they would be able to do that without breaking. They are bundled and they have 5 leaves in a bundle. So the best way to remember that it's a white pine is that white has 5 letters in the name. So it's got 5 leaves in its bundle as well. When considering the bark, it is gray and it's got very thick ridges and furrows in it, especially as it gets older. So that is our first species, the eastern white pine. Next, we've got our red pine, Pinus resinosa. It also has conical needles that are a dark green, and they tend to be longer than that of the white pine, so between 10 and 16 centimeters long. And they're quite a bit thicker, so you'll notice that they are more thick and full looking when you're looking at them. And they're quite brittle as well. So if you were to try to tie this one in a knot, it would actually break. So if you find one, that's a good way to test it as well. They are bundled, of course, and they have 2 leaves to a bundle, sometimes 3, but usually 2. So the way you can tell the difference for white and red, if you get your hands on the needles, is that red is a shorter word, and it only has 2 or 3 needles in it, corresponding to how many letters in the word red. And for white, we've got 5 letters in white and 5 in the bundle for white. For the bark, it is more of a scaly barked species, as you guys can see, and it's gray with a slight reddish pink hue to it. So that is our red pine. Next here, we've got our Scots Pine, also referred to as Scotch pine sometimes as well, but I was taught it as Scots, so that's what I'm going to go with today. And the scientific name for it is Pinus sylvestris. It is another common species in Muskoka. However, it is actually an introduced or invasive species. So it was brought over from Europe to North America. I read one thing that said the 1600s and another that said the 1900s. So it's been here for hundreds of years, essentially. And so it is a common one that you will still see around, even though it is not native. It, of course, has conical needles as well that tend to be a more dull grayish green. They are quite short compared to the red pine, only 4 to 8 centimeters long. And they are quite stiff and tend to have a twisted appearance to them as well, which you can see in some of the needles on this twig or branch here. They are bundled in groups of 2, quite similar to the red pine. And for their bark, it is a grayish red to brown, especially at the bottom. But the unique thing about Scots pine, which makes it really easy to identify, is that if you look up close to the top of the tree, it will actually transition into a bright orangish red, really thin and papery, flaky bark. So it's very unique to Scots pine. So if you're just looking at one, make sure to look up, and if it's got that bright orange, peely, flaky bark up top, you know exactly what you're looking at, and it is Scots pine. Next is our eastern white cedar. So this is also known as Thuya occidentalis. So that is another very fun one to say. And this is the only species we'll be looking at today that has that scale type leaf. So it's got the scales on it. And another species that will have that is juniper species, but those are shrubs often found in rock barren areas. So we won't be looking at that species today. For the color, it's more of a yellowish green, and it is considered to be single for its arrangement with some branching, as you can see as well, branching off. The bark is quite unique for eastern white cedar as well. It's got the brownish gray strips to it that are long and narrow and vertical. And that is fairly unique to the eastern white cedar. So combined with the unique bark and the unique leaves, it's a pretty easy one to identify. Next is our eastern hemlock. This is an interesting spelling. It's pronounced Tsuga canadensis, so the T is silent. And it is the first one we're looking at that has flat needles. So up top, they are a shiny green, and they do have a sort of white stripe on the bottom as well. They are quite short, only 1 to 2 centimeters long, and they are attached with a stalk. So it might be a little bit difficult to see, but you'll see it looks like they're coming directly off, and there's a small stalk that attaches them to the branch. So that is our eastern hemlock. And as mentioned, they are singly coming off the branch, and they are not bundled at all. The bark is a dark brown, and it also has a red to purple color underneath. So if you just flick off the top layer, I don't recommend doing it to every tree you see, but if you're trying to identify one specifically, if you flick off the top layer, you'll notice this reddish purple, almost like a red wine color underneath. And that is quite unique to eastern hemlock. And it also, of course, has deep furrows and ridges as well. It is often confused with the next species we're looking at, which is our balsam fir. And that's because these are our two main species that have the flat needles that are coming out singly from the branch. This one is dark green as well. These are the main two differences. The balsam fir is a little bit longer, so it is noticeably longer when you're looking at them side by side. So it gets up to 2.5 centimeters long, and it is stalkless, also referred to as sessile, which means, hopefully you guys can see, I should have enlarged this photo a bit, but the leaves will connect directly to the twig or to the branch, instead of having that stalk like the eastern hemlock does. The branches and leaves as well have a strong smell that the eastern hemlock will not have. So it's got that really nice Christmas tree smell. Even if you just rub it through your hands a little bit, it is quite fragrant. For the bark, it is quite smooth and grayish brown, and it will have these raised little blisters full of resin, especially in the springtime as well. So that is our balsam fir. I forgot to say the scientific name, oopsies. It is Abies balsamea for our balsam fir, another fun one. Next is our white spruce, which is Picea glauca. It has needles, and they are the square shape. So in the photo, you might be able to see that they're a bit more ridgy to them. So you would be able to actually roll them between your fingers because of those ridges. So you can always pluck one off and see if it does that, to see if it's a spruce, compared to the last two we looked at, the hemlock and the fir, which are flat. So they wouldn't roll if you tried to roll them between your fingers. They're also quite stiff and straight, and they tend to be a green to bluish green color, and quite short as well, around the same length as our balsam fir needles. They are single coming off of the branch as well, but you'll notice with our spruces that the leaves tend to be all concentrated on the top of the branch, whereas with our last two we looked at, the needles are coming directly out from the sides and they don't really come out on top. Our spruces will be full on top as well. So that's another good way to tell the difference. The bark for the white spruce is a brown, gray, pinkish color, and it's got those obvious scales, sort of flaky scales to it as well. That is our white spruce. Hopefully I'm not going too quick for everyone. Our last conifer we'll look at is our unique one that is missing its leaves in the wintertime, and that is our tamarack, as we mentioned before. It is called Laricinea in its Latin or scientific name. If you are looking at the needles, they are considered flat, and they tend to be a bluish green color, and they're quite short as well, but they can get up to 5 centimeters. They are bundled, and they're considered to be in tufts because there are many, many needles within a bundle, anywhere between 15 and 60 needles per tuft. And they will all come out of those individual sort of stalks there. The bark tends to be a reddish brown to gray, and it does tend to have that underneath color as well if you flake some pieces off, and it, of course, is quite scaly. So that is our tamarack, and that is the end of our conifers. So now we'll look at our deciduous trees, which of course will be a little bit different. So we'll be looking at the twigs and bark. And I'm just going to take a sip of water. Okay, so the first thing you'll want to consider when you're looking at a deciduous tree is the arrangement of the buds or the leaves. Specifically today, of course, we're looking at the buds. So they will either be opposite or alternate. So opposite, of course, is when the buds are directly across from each other, like in our white ash here, compared to alternate, where, of course, the buds are alternating where they are on the stem. I'll get back to your question at the end, Katie. I do see it there, and if I forget to answer it, let me know. So yes, alternating or opposite. This will help you to rule out certain species right off the bat. So it's a really important first step that I recommend you all take. So once you've determined if it is alternate or opposite, you can take a closer look at the twigs and buds. So for our twigs, you'll want to consider the color, the markings that it might have on it. Some of them may have a specific smell as well, and you'll also want to consider the size. So they may be slender and thin, or they might be thick and stout. For our buds, you'll want to consider the shape. So if they're long, if they're oval, if they're cone-shaped, if they're rounded. You'll want to consider the color as well, the size, which also corresponds to how long and what their length is. I've also included this little diagram here. I'm pretty much going to ignore everything that's at the bottom, though, because we're not going to get that deep into things today. But I will mention some of these terms that you'll notice in the top half of the display. So I will definitely be talking about the terminal buds, which is the buds that are on the end of the twig. Each bud will also have scales on it. So those are called the bud scales. And the lateral buds are those that are found on the sides. And some will have a leaf scar, so where the previous leaf has fallen off and left a little scar behind. And on the twig, you may notice little dots, which are called lenticels, and they are essentially the area where gas exchange happens in the twigs. So that's it for our twigs and buds. And for our bark, you're going to be looking at the same things that we described for the coniferous trees. So whether it is rough in appearance with furrows and ridges like this one, whether it's smooth with no ridges, or whether it's got scaly and more flaky bark. And you'll also consider the color. And so with that, we'll jump into identifying some of our deciduous trees. So first off, we've got our sugar maple. The first couple ones we'll look at are those with opposite arrangement, and then we'll look at our alternate arrangement ones. So with our sugar maple, it is called Acer saccharum. The terminal buds as well as the lateral buds are quite pointed at their tips, and they tend to be a medium dark brown caramel color, quite similar to the twig as well. The twigs are considered thin or slender, and they have that shiny reddish brown caramel color. The bark when they are young is a smooth gray, and as they age, it will get more deep ridges, and furrows tend to be vertical as well, as you can see in our very old sugar maple picture here. Next is our red maple or silver maple. So you'll see I've grouped the two together here, and that's because they're actually very, very similar. And in the winter time, you can't really tell the difference between the two. So I've grouped them together. Red maple is Acer rubrum and silver maple is Acer saccharinum. So of course, these guys are opposite in arrangement as well. Compared to the sugar maple, they have quite a rounded bud, both the lateral and the terminal buds. And hopefully you guys can see, this is about where the buds start. So you'll see that it is twice as long as it is wide. And that is unique to the red and silver maple. And they are red, shiny, and quite large. So especially when you are looking up into the highest branches of a red or silver maple, the buds get really, really huge on them, and you can easily identify them that way. Opposite arrangement, really huge buds, especially later in springtime. For the twigs, they are considered thin as well, and they have a shiny red color. And you'll see here at the bottom of this twig is where the older growth is, and that's where it's more of a gray-brown color. The bark, when young, is a smooth gray, and as it gets older, it gets more of those scaly ridges, and they tend to peel, that's the word I was looking for, peel vertically with our silver and red maple. So you'll see that they're coming off vertically there. Our next opposite tree family is the ash family. So first we're looking at white ash, which is Fraximus americana. Its buds, or its terminal bud, is wider than it is long. And the two uppermost lateral buds generally will be touching the terminal bud. So as you can see here, we've got the two lateral buds on the side, and they are right up against the terminal bud. And they tend to be a reddish, sort of chocolatey brown color. They are also, the twigs are considered thick and stout for the ash family. And for the white ash, they tend to be a shiny purple to gray color, getting more dull with age. The bark is a light gray, and it has deep furrows and ridges, which create a pretty uniform diamond pattern in the bark, which you can see pictured here. And that is our white ash. Next, we'll look at the black ash. So it is opposite in arrangement as well, of course, although this one is a little bit funky, but that is considered opposite. It's another thing to take into consideration that although these are pretty standard tips and tricks to follow, there will always be some slight exceptions as well. So you have to be flexible and keep an open mind for that. For the terminal bud, it is quite broad and pointed, and the two uppermost lateral buds are set down below the terminal bud, so they won't touch like they do with the white ash. And they are also a very dark brown. The twigs, of course, again, are thick and stout, and they tend to be green with purple lenticels or dots on them when they are fresh, but this is an older one, so it's more of a dull gray color. The bark is considered a light gray or brown, and it's got very soft, corky ridges, which I like to describe as oatmeal thrown on a tree. So it's quite like squishy and soft to the touch. There's no pattern to it, and it sort of just looks like a pile of oatmeal. Another thing to consider is the habitat. And so with our black ash, they are found more in wet lowland areas and in swamps. So they don't mind having their feet wet at all. And that is our black ash. And so now we'll move into our alternate species, and we're starting with white birch. And the way this is pronounced is Betula papyrifera for our white birch. And I think I forgot to mention the scientific name for black ash, which is Fraxinus nigra. Okay, back to white birch. So as mentioned, it is alternate in arrangement. The buds are quite slender and narrow, and it's a little bit difficult to see, but they have a greenish color at the base and they get more brown at the tip. The twigs are considered slender, of course, as you can see here, and they have sparse white resin glands on them, which almost give them a pretzel-like look and texture as well. So that's a helpful tip to remember. And they tend to be a dark reddish brown color. And some of my pictures aren't the greatest, but hopefully you guys can see some of those white spots there. For the bark, as I mentioned, color will change throughout its life. So when it's young, it is actually a very dark reddish brown, similar to that of the twigs. And it's only as it gets older that it gets to starts to get its very characteristic white bark, shedding in those thick paper-like pieces that we all recognize the white birch for. Next is our yellow birch, another extremely fun one to say. It is Betula alleganiensis. Of course, alternate in arrangement. The buds are slender and sharp-pointed, and it's of course hard to see here, but they tend to have a little bit of fine hair on them when they are young and fresh. And same with the twigs too. So the twigs are slender, of course, with some hair. They're a uniform light brown color. And these are one of the species that has a smell to it and a taste, but I don't recommend just putting twigs in your mouths. But yeah, it actually has an amazing wintergreen smell to it. I also don't recommend cracking open every yellow birch that you find to give it a sniff. But if you are really trying to figure it out, if you take off a small piece, you'll definitely be able to smell that wintergreen. For the bark, of course, it has quite recognizable bark as well as it gets older with age, but it does start out as a thin, shiny reddish brown color. And as it gets older, it gets those nice golden yellow, thin, curly, papery strips that start to come off, which are pictured here. Yellow birch. Next are our aspens or poplars. So first we're looking at trembling aspen, which is Populus tremuloides. It is alternate in arrangement, and its buds are quite conical in shape and pointed, and the tips tend to curl inwards towards the twig. They also have a bit of a shiny, waxy appearance to them, and they are a reddish brown color. The twigs are considered slender, and they have that shiny, dark color to them, generally greenish or a brown gray. This is quite an old twig that I took a photo of, so it looks a little bit gnarly. But if you're looking at a young sapling, it won't look as gnarly as this one. The bark for our poplars or aspens is quite unique as well. So when you're looking at the base of a tree, it has, it's generally like a lighter dark gray, which is quite furrowed with ridges at the bottom. But as soon as you start looking up, you'll see that it transitions into a smoother, whitish gray color for our trembling aspen. So sometimes it will actually get confused for a birch because it's got such a white color at the top. But remember that it starts furrowed and rough at the bottom, and then will transition into that smoother white color. So that is our trembling aspen. The next one is our large tooth aspen, or Populus grandidentata. So that's an easy one to remember because if you guys know any French, dent or dent is tooth, so large tooth, and grand as well, so large tooth aspen. Fun little explanation of the Latin behind it. So of course, yes, they are alternate in their arrangement of the buds. They are quite oval in shape, and they are a dull brown, and you might be able to see some of the fine white hair that they will get as well. The lateral buds are more slender than that large terminal bud, and they're generally held close to the branch. The twigs are considered thin or slender, and they are a dull brownish gray, and they will have that fine hair on the fresh new growth as well. The bark is similar to that of the trembling aspen, which we just covered. So it's a dark furrowed gray at the bottom, as pictured here. And then as you look up towards the top, it will smooth out. But instead of being a white color, it's sort of variable. It could be more green or yellow or gray. And sometimes it even has an orange hue at the top as well. So that is our large tooth aspen. Next is our white elm, which is Ulmus americana. Its arrangement, of course, is opposite, and it's got quite a unique terminal bud. So it is what's called canted, which means it's sort of at a 45-degree angle from the stem. The buds in general are quite oval and narrow in shape, and you'll see here that they're held very, very tightly against the stem. And they tend to be a reddish-brown color, and they sometimes will have a fine hair on them as well. The twigs are very, very slender and thin, and they are a grayish-brown color. And our bark for the white elm is a dark grayish-brown and quite deeply furrowed as well, but not quite as uniform and clear as the white ash that we looked at earlier. And so that is our elm. American beech is Fagus grandifolia, and it is one of my favorite ones because it is very unique and very easy to identify. It has opposite arrangement, and its buds are very, very unique. So they are quite long, as you can see, 1.5 to 2.5 centimeters long. They are slender, and they are very pointed as well. The lateral buds will also point directly out from the stem, and they have a very unique color too. So pretty much everything about them is pretty unique. So they are a sort of a bright orangish brown color, which is quite similar to the twigs as well, which are thin and slender and have that same coloration. The bark is unique as well. It is very, very smooth throughout its entire life. Unfortunately, sometimes you will see it with cankers because many of our American beeches are affected by beech bark disease, which causes cankers and different growths to show up on the bark. But generally, a healthy one will have the smooth blue-gray bark. Another interesting thing that I've added is that they will hold their leaves in the winter as well. So a few different species will do that, and the American beech is one of them, as you can see here with the old leaves attached. Next is our ironwood, Austria virginiana. This gets its name, ironwood, for being a very, very strong wood. It has alternate arrangement, of course. The buds are quite oval in shape, and they have a point to them as well. And the lateral buds will stick out. They aren't held closely to the stem. And they are generally a greenish brown in color. Here they're more of that brownish color, and sometimes they'll have hair as well. The twigs are very, very thin and slender. The main way to help you identify it is that the buds are going to be wider, almost twice as wide as the twig is thick. They tend to have a zigzag appearance to them as well, which you can sort of see here, but is quite recognizable as they get older and their branches get longer and grow more. And they tend to be a reddish brown color. The bark is a grayish brown, and it is actually kind of similar to our eastern cedar tree, if you guys remember what that bark looked like. So it has these narrow vertical strips to it, similar to the cedar, but of course, easy way to tell the difference is one is coniferous and one is deciduous, but it is actually surprisingly similar. Next is our red oak. This is Crocus rubra. It has alternate arrangement, of course, as well. The buds are oval in shape and wide, and they are pointed at the tips with hairs along the tips as well. The terminal bud for all oaks, we'll look at one more oak next. The terminal buds are actually a cluster of multiple buds, and this is unique specifically to oak trees, have this feature. The buds, in terms of their color, are a shiny reddish brown. The twigs are considered quite thick and stout for oaks as well, and for a red oak, it's a reddish brown color. The bark is pretty fun too. It's a dark gray all around, but it is grooved and almost has a look as if it's splitting. So that's why I refer to it as hot dog splits. So if you guys are cooking hot dogs on the barbecue, you'll notice, of course, that they begin to split as they get cooked, and that's sort of what the red oak looks like as well. And the coloration in those splits and cracks that are coming through tends to be a reddish pink color as well. And I've also added for our red oak that this is another one of our species, including other species of oak as well, that will also hold their leaves during the winter as well. Not as frequently as the American beech does, but they will quite commonly hold their leaves as well. This is actually our last species that we are talking about, and this is our white oak. So this is Quercus alba. It has the alternate arrangement as well, quite oval buds, but they are very rounded compared to the red oak, but they do have the clustered terminal bud as well, as all oak species do, and the color is a reddish brown color. The twigs, similar to red oak, are thick and stout, and they tend to have, for white oak, a more reddish green to brown color, sometimes gray too, so it's quite variable for the white oak. The bark is a pale gray, and it tends to be quite scaly. So that is it for our deciduous species. Before I move on to my next slide, I'll just ask if we have any questions about any of our deciduous species. Looks like we are all good. Okay, so I'll go through our little bonus section about spring ephemerals, and then I'll get to our questions. So our bonus spring ephemerals, I just had to chat about them because I'm so excited for spring. So of course, these are our species that sprout early in spring, usually in April. Some of the ones pictured here aren't a bit until later May as well, but they're usually a nice sign that spring and summer is on the way. And yeah, just a nice reminder of that. And they are usually only around for a short period of time as well, or only in bloom for a short period of time. So for our first one here, this is our yellow trout lily. And it gets its name due to the coloring and sort of speckling-like pattern on the leaves that is similar to a trout. And it's got the unique yellow bell sort of shaped flowers. So that's our yellow trout lily. Usually grows in like a colony, so there are many around. Next is our painted trillium. So very similar to the very common large white trillium, except this one has a nice little pinkish or reddish, purplish ring around the center. And so it almost looks like it's been painted on, and that's how it gets its name. This one was seen, and its photo was taken at our Upjohn Nature Reserve. The middle one here is our pink lady slipper. So this is actually a member of the orchid family, and it usually does bloom later in May, so it isn't quite an early spring ephemeral. But it gets its name because its flower looks like a beautiful pink slipper. Next in the bottom there is our sharp-lobed hepatica. So this is quite an early bloomer in our woodlands, and it's got these leaves with 3 lobes, and they are sharp, so that's how it gets its name. And it's got usually it's pinkish, purplish, whitish flower that sprouts from it. and its leaves will actually start out as a green, but as it gets older, it turns to this burgundy red color. And our last spring ephemeral that I will chat about is our bunchberry, which is another really pretty one. But a unique thing about it is that it actually belongs to the dogwood family. So if you're familiar with red osier dogwood, which is a pretty common sort of shoreline wetland shrub, you might notice that the leaves and the veining of the leaves is quite similar to those in the dogwood family, except this is a small flowering plant and not actually a shrub. So that is our spring ephemerals, and I hope we are all looking forward to seeing them soon. Before I get to questions, I will also just mention that we do have an upcoming nature quest, which will be taking some of the knowledge that we've learned today about how to identify trees out onto the land. So it is this Thursday, March 31st at 10 a.m. At our Upjohn Nature Reserve in Bracebridge. We have 4 spots left, and we'll be taking a look at some of the trees that we talked about today. So if you are interested and you would like to come, you can email or give me a call to reserve your spot. And I've got my information on the next slide here. And I do see we've got some questions, so I'll answer those as well. So Katie had asked if I could discuss the differences between white and black spruce. And the main difference is that helps me to identify them is the habitat. So black spruce is one of those species that is really found in wet, swampy or boggy-like habitats. And so you won't really find it in the same areas as white spruce, which is more of an upland species, prefers the drier areas. In terms of the twig, or not the twigs, but the leaves themselves, they are really quite similar. I believe the bark is quite similar as well. But I think the coloration is a bit different. So the black spruce tends to be a darker color, whereas the white spruce is that lighter, almost bluish green color. But the main difference that I use is just the habitat. The shape of the tree tends to be different as well, with white spruce tending to grow like taller and fuller with like branches coming out, whereas the black spruce growing in these wet areas tends to be a bit more stunted, so it doesn't grow as tall and it tends to have more droopy branches. But I did not look too in depth because I was just covering the white spruce for this presentation. So definitely, if you want to stop by the office, you could take a look at some of the books that we have here to take a closer look at the differences, but those are the main ways that I tell the difference. So hopefully that answered your question and was helpful. Awesome. We also had a question about how common ironwood are. I'm not sure exactly. We do have them around in Muskoka. I've definitely seen them on quite a few of our properties, but I'm not sure how common they are compared to some of our other common species. They are probably, you're less likely to see them than our common maples and our oaks, but they're definitely out there as well. So hopefully that helps to answer your question, but I'm not 100% sure exactly on how common they are. I also got a question about if there's any apps that are recommended specifically for tree ID. I actually haven't used too many for tree ID specifically. The main one I'll use is iNaturalist, which is for everything. So you can post any species on there and it will help to give you recommendations, but I'm not actually sure about one that is specific for trees. So that's a good question. Someone asked if bunchberries are safe to eat. I am not going to answer that question because I'm actually not 100% sure. And so I don't want to say yes or no and sway you in the wrong direction if they are. But definitely Google it if you're interested. Everything's edible once, I like to say. Some things you can only eat once and then that's it because they're poisonous. But that's just, I'm not 100% sure. So I definitely would have to check that out. We also got a question about whether the Conservancy gets involved in reforestation. That's a really great question. Most of the properties that we like to acquire tend to be in good condition, and most do not require reforestation. So we're generally getting ones that have well-established forests already. But I believe there have been cases where we've got a property that has had an area that has been cleared. So we have done tree planting in the past. That was before I joined the Conservancy. So I don't know too much about it yet. But if we did acquire a piece of land that had really awesome habitat and it did have a portion that was cleared, we may very well do a little bit of a reforestation project to revitalize and regenerate that area. So it is something we've done occasionally in the past as needed, but not always we'll do that. So yeah, great question. I'll just see if I have missed any yet. But I think I got all of them so far. Does anyone have any other questions about our species of trees, or any questions about the Conservancy? If you'd like me to go back to a specific slide, let me know. I'll hang around to see if we get any more questions.